What did William James think about this case at the end? After Carla became a socialite and I guess ingrained herself in society, normal society, so to speak. What did William James, did he ever talk about this case again, or was it something that he just forgot about?
He wrote a letter to Prince. Let me see if I can't find it. It's just a short letter, but it was in 1906 after the book came out, Dissociation of a Personality. So he kind of gives him a left-handed compliment, as they say. He says, Prince, dear Prince, you will hardly believe me, I fear, but I have only just attained to reading your dissociation book. Not only is the case destined to be historic, but your exposition is a masterpiece of lucidity and narrative art. But who or what is the demon? Isn't that the dark point? Ever truly yours, William James. I think that tells you all you need to know. He refers to
Was
it as a demon, and he goes, you don't sort of get to the root cause here.
was that question ever answered by any of them, in your opinion?
Oh, Richard Hodgson certainly believed it was demonic possession. So did Leonora Piper, and Hodgson wrote some papers on it, and made references to it in the Psychical Society magazines, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So he was a firm believer, that this was demonic possession, and a firm believer in the spiritual world, and even that the spiritual world could be contacted. Like a lot of spiritualists, there were, I think it was 9 million spiritualists in Europe and the United States at that time, people that believed in mediums. So Arthur Conan Doyle, author
Yep.
of Sherlock Holmes, Madame
Ch-
Curie, the
Charles
founder of X-rays,
Charles Dickens.
Charles Dickens. Yeah, so it was not a an eccentric belief. And really, if you look at our society, Western society, almost every society in the world has believed in a spiritual world of one kind or another to a greater or lesser degree. It's really just since modern times, and I'd say you could probably clock it back to the atom bomb, where technology really started to create a secular view of the world. But this is a relatively recent development.
Is evil real? Is it a metaphor for the bad things people do? Or does it prowl the earth like a living, breathing entity that possesses the souls of vulnerable humans? The Unwelcomed begins with the arrival of a young Radcliffe student at the office of renowned psychotherapist Dr. Morton Prince. Pursued by a city marshal hell-bent on solving the murder of 2 infants strangled by her father, Clara Fowler relives the nightmare that was her childhood. Exalted by visitations from Jesus Christ and the Blessed Virgin, cursed by the emergence of a demonic presence obsessed with her demise. What did it all mean? And how did each of these murders link with the serial killings of Jack the Ripper and H.H. Holmes? The answer the grizzled lawman discovers is more shocking than he could ever imagine. Ron Felber is a graduate of Georgetown University, Loyola University, and Drew University, where he earned his doctorate. He began his career writing stories for True Detective magazine and the iconic Nick Carter series while working as a deputy sheriff transporting federal prisoners. The Runaway earned Ron the United Press International Award for Fiction. He was the recipient of the Albright Award for his nonfiction bestseller, Mojave Incident. Some of his books have made their way to film and television, including The Mojave Incident, Dottore, The Double Life of a Mafia Doctor, and The Hunt for Khun Sa. His most recent title, The Unwelcomed, The Curious Case of Clara Fowler, winner of the 2024 Maxi Award for Book of the Year, is based on a true medical case history passed along to him by William Peter Blatty, author of The Exorcist. Ron boxed Golden Gloves, holds a blue belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and was CEO of a major manufacturing company for more than a decade. He teaches creative writing at Drew University's Casperson School of Graduate Studies in Madison, New Jersey. Wow, that is a pretty impressive bio. you boxed for a while, Ron, did you?
I did. Actually, I fought Golden Gloves for a couple of years now. This was a ways back, Vic. It
Well,
wasn't last week.
well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I was really looking forward to speaking to you. Let me ask you this, Ron. I know I'm reading your book and it's fantastic. It's well written, folks. I can tell you that for sure. It is a fantastically written book, and it really is a page turner. It's one of those books that every chapter you have to read the next chapter. Can I ask you this? When did you first come across this? When did the inception of this book take place?
Actually, I was a student at Georgetown University, and I'll give away my age a little bit. I was a sophomore in 1972, and they were filming The Exorcist at Georgetown campus. So I was a writer even then. I was writing short stories in grammar school and high school and whatnot. So in college, I finally wrote my first novel. So with them filming, William Friedkin was there, William Peter Blatty, the author of The Exorcist. I wanted to meet Bill Blatty. I wanted to give him my book and say, look, you went to Georgetown, I went to Georgetown, you grew up in Brooklyn, I grew up in Newark. What do you say? Give me a hand with this book and help me get it published. Well, I did meet him, and I got a call from him, actually. I gave the book to his secretary, and I got a call from him over Thanksgiving holiday. I was with my parents in New Jersey, and he said, I'd like to meet with you. So we met, and back then, around that time, he gave me the story. He said, in my research, I uncovered a couple of really good cases that are pretty well documented. And the one that's best documented is of Clara Fowler. The records of the case are archived at the Harvard Medical School Library. And I'm not going to do the book. I'm on to other things. But maybe you want to do it, and I'll get you access to the information.
Whoa! So you've had these documents, you've had these reports for quite a number of years before the book actually came out.
Oh, yeah. This is I call this book 50 years in the making, because really at the end, I tried to write it. But, as with many things, when you're younger, and I was, 19, 20 years old, I just didn't have the talent to do a book like this, which is, as you know, just from reading it, it's complex. The research is, pretty arduous, and to put it in all of this story into a framework that's, really readable and not a medical case history, but a sort of novelized book that you can read and enjoy and is entertaining also. So that was the catch. And about 3 years ago, I said, I have all this research. I didn't have a new book in mind at the time. I said, let me give another shot at this, and I'm glad I did.
How true is it to the original? How true is it to the facts, do you think? Was it like in a percentage? What would you say? How true is it?
Well, of the case itself, and by that I mean the woman, Clara Fowler, Dr. Prince, and his associates, I would say it's 95% true, because I pulled it all from the transcripts. The only thing I did do was modernize the language a little bit. You know how it is, shall and whilst, and there were just different
late Victorian.
Yeah, different idioms, and so I did modernize it. But other than that, it's as real as can be.
Wow. How did it affect you reading these reports, having these reports? Well, like how did it affect you as a human being? Like, did it enhance your spiritual aspect on life? Like, how would
Yes,
you?
yes. It's funny, when I did it when I was younger, and again, like all things, when you're 19, 20 years old, you're certainly a different person than when you're fully grown and maybe at the back nine, as they call it. It affect me, particularly more recently this time around, because I got some additional information. I had hired a detective to help follow the genealogy, Clara's parents, her background, she had a marriage, a sort of false start marriage, about her ex-husband, all these kinds of things. But what I've come to is that evil is very real. I knew that from transporting federal prisoners, but what I didn't know was that it can be so demonstrable, that it can really jump out at you, and you have a woman whose face remolds into another face, whose voice changes from this sweet, saintly woman who wants to be a nun, and join a convent, has visitations from the Virgin Mary, visitations from Jesus Christ. So she has a religious calling, to this monstrous creature that really, her eyes just, menacing eyes, just comb the room, and it's shocking. This particular situation, she spoke in languages that she had no ability to know, had the strength of superhuman strength. And so it convinced me on a couple levels that the spiritual world is very real. And as a matter of fact, the spiritual world, in my view, is much more real than the world that we live in. And a lot of the new physics points to that, in terms of quantum mechanics, and even the way we look at evolution these days, far differently from even 10 or 15 years ago. And for example, I read a book recently by a guy named Hoffman, and it was called The Case Against Reality. And he's a physicist, and basically his argument is that the human brain screens most of reality from us. It's a form of evolution, so that we get food, we procreate, we go to a warm shelter, and we survive. That's what the human brain is geared towards, not looking at the full picture, because if we ever did see the full picture, or the reality of what's real, it would probably blow our minds. We couldn't cope.
We can only see an aspect of the spectrum, the spectrum as it is. That's been proved by science.
Yes.
So I'm with you 100% on that. Well, going back to Carla, the character of Carla, and you were talking about, the dichotomy between her saintly and devilish selves.
Yes.
Can you speak more about that? Like, who witnessed her going into these spasms, or these fits, or these exaltation? Like, who witnessed her? Was it hearsay, or was there actual academics studying her?
Well, this really is the charm, I think, of the story, because what Prince did. Prince was one of the Dr. Morton Prince from Boston. Was a Boston Brahmin, as they say, from Back Bay. His father had been mayor of Boston. He came from a genealogy of wealth and influence, and was a Harvard Medical School graduate. So when he came across this case, he had a rivalry with Sigmund Freud, who was in Austria, and the rivalry was for the direction that psychiatry would take into the 20th century. And he was a materialist. He believed that if you had some Tourette syndrome, for example, or schizophrenia, that it dealt with an imbalance in the brain, a chemical imbalance, or a lesion in the brain, that these symptoms could be traced back to something physical, which made him what you call now a behavioralist. But he assembled a team of William James. William James was a prominent, one of the prominent forces in American medicine, and the inventor, really, of abnormal psychology. He's the first person in the country to teach abnormal psychology at Harvard Medical School. But he had also a protege named George Waterman, also a Harvard Medical School graduate. And he was smart enough to bring in a couple of others, like Richard Hodgson, who was the president of the Boston Psychical Research Society. So he was a spiritualist, and then also Leonora Piper, who was a clairvoyant. So that he had a team studying this case, a stenographer there. So what I could see were really actual, the actual transcripts from sessions, which was a treasure trove for me.
And how many of these sessions did they have, Ron? Were there 12 or 100? Like, how many exactly?
Well, this went from, I couldn't tell you an exact number, but I can tell you that it started in 1898 and ended in 1904 with her cure. And oddly enough, Mick, this is what I think is kind of mind-bending. When she was cured in 1904, Prince wrote a book in 1906 called Dissociation of a Personality. So he changed all the names. So she was unidentifiable. the name Clara Fowler, I uncovered through research. What he called her in the book was Sally Beauchamp, Christine Beauchamp. And so basically, this went on for a number of years, and she wound up marrying George Waterman, who was a member of the team, and lived a normal life. He had a practice about 7 doors down from Morton Prince on Beacon Street, and she wound up becoming a socialite, one of the prominent socialites in Boston high society. So how's that for a turn of events?
And do we know anything about her after that? Did she function well as a human being, or as a somebody in society, or did she have other attacks?
Early along, there were steps backwards, but not to any great extent. And of course, I guess she was lucky enough to have a prominent psychiatrist as a husband, and a psychotherapist, so that if these relapses happened, and they did, but not to a great degree and not often, and she outgrew that over time. She lived a very normal life. As a matter of fact, like I said, she was a socialite. She was married for a number of years, died in her 80s. Her husband, George Waterman, died a few years before that. They wound up moving to Maine, where he had a summer house, and they lived there for the back end of their years.
Mm-hmm. One of your quotes in the book, Ron, is by Carl Jung, and it's "Possession has by no means become obsolete, only the name has changed to neuroses or unconscious complexes." I like Jung. But Jung's the other person that was associated with Jung, and of course they had different ideas, was, as you mentioned before, Sigmund Freud. What was his idea about demonic possession, Sigmund Freud's?
I really have to say I'm not an expert on that. I can tell you that that there was literally a feud that went on between Sigmund Freud and Morton Prince. I mentioned, Prince was sort of a bread and butter kind of guy. Even though he was highly educated and whatnot, he had a point of view that he didn't really believe in a spiritual world. He thought the human brain might have the capacity for clairvoyance or for telekinesis, but it would be a natural, not a supernatural phenomenon. He thought that psychoanalysis, which was the basis of Sigmund Freud's of a book, Interpretations of a Dream, in 1901, which really was a landmark work, he thought it was pseudo-intellectual, rubbish, pseudo-intellectual rubbish. So I guess that's a pretty clear statement. And Freud called Prince a blockhead, a prudish blockhead. And so they really didn't get along very well, and they were battling for, again, who would take the reins of psychiatry going into the future. And Prince had a really vested interest to make this case a new disease. He wanted to outshine Freud, and he thought, yeah, look at this case. I've got this woman, all the signs of demonic possession. You put a Bible in front of her and she goes into fits. Everything, languages, strength, different voices, different facial features, all of the classic symptoms that even the Catholic Church would say this is demonic possession. And so he thought that if he could take what he considered a disease, a condition, medical condition that goes back to the Bible, and shine the purifying light of scientific methodology on it, and say, well, I've come to know why this happens, and I know how to cure it, and this is what it is. And so he wrote a book called Dissociation of a Personality, which really almost argues, if you read it, really argues almost for the case of demonic possession. But of course, he comes up with the idea that it's dissociation, and by dissociation, I mean, it's sort of like a train going off the tracks. So you're on this track, which is your normal life, and then there's a catastrophic event that throws you off that track. And since Clara Fowler was saintly, really believed she had a religious calling, wanted to be a nun, had these visitations from Jesus Christ and from the Madonna, the natural counterpart to that, once the personality goes off the tracks, is demonic. And so these forces battled for control of the body. So there were times, and not a few, where with incredible rapidity, Clara would say, help me, help me. And then the face of this hideous expression of the demon would say, the body is mine. This is my body. And the demonic presence, the second consciousness, hated Clara Fowler, hated all she stood for, and wanted to kill her. It believed that it could survive and take the body over if she was dead.
Mhm. Ron, just going back there to Prince, you were mentioning about when Prince was trying to, I guess he was trying to ground this disease in a materialist sense so he could have something tangible to point at. I guess his whole objective was to kind of ground it in the material world of science. Do you think
Yes.
that was his plan, or did he actually think this is a spiritual condition in the sense of that Carl Jung thought it was?
Yeah. I think that like most people, if you have a particular point of view, let's say politics, you interpret what happens in a different way from who has a different point of view in politics, let's say. So if a particular politician does something and you like him, you're going to say, well, there's a reason for that, and there's a good reason for that, and really it's not a bad thing. Well, similarly, he had this fundamental lens that he saw everything through. And so if this comes to him, what is he going to say? He's not going to change the lens. He's going to say, let me see how I can fit this into my viewpoint.
So when he was dealing with Carla, was he coming from his viewpoint, but accepting her way of belief to try to counteract that, like to treat her like he wasn't trying to convince her that it was a material problem. He was kind of like going into her world and saying, okay, if you believe this is how I'm going to treat you with this.
Yeah, I think that's true to some extent. I mean, he first started with just basic things. So she came to him incredibly fatigued, unable to sleep at night, no appetite, and they called it neurasthenia at the time. That was the catchphrase. A little like Jung, you put a name on it. You might not understand what it is, but if you put a name on it, it's okay. So they called it neurasthenia. But then she went to a general practitioner, Dr. Putnam, and he just said, this is way out of my league. So he brought in Prince and please take the case. I don't know how to handle this. William James then joined the team. But, at the end, he had his point of view, and it's almost contradictory. I have a couple quotes. I'll give you a quote, okay? This is from his book. He said about Clara, Clara saw the Virgin in a marked way, describing her appearance, using her hands to point out the positions of the entities involved and their surroundings, as if they stood before her. She regarded herself as possessed in the same way that a person in the Bible is said to be possessed. Then he talks about hallucinations. Hallucinations are on every hand. As she walked through the streets, an endless procession of black-robed figures accompanied her, some with familiar faces, most with countenances that changed horribly from moment to moment. And then talking about a Bible or exorcism, which he used for shock therapy. Putting my finger to her forehead, I held up a cross, reciting the words from the rites of exorcism. The effect was remarkable. She shrank from me like Mephistopheles, shrinking from the cross, cursing God, the saints, and all things holy, screaming that it made a terrible, painful sensation run through her body. She feared it more than anything. So, I mean, this is from his actual interpretation. These are the symptoms, and it's really incredible. So at the end, Prince actually was starting to have nightmares himself. She had a sense of clairvoyance. So when she got violent, she'd have this incredible strength, and she'd be incredibly violent, and even though she probably weighed 100 pounds, she had the strength of 10 people. So it took the others to restrain her. And what they would do is take ether and clamp it over her nose and mouth to not really anesthetize her. But even then, and this is one of the amazing things, the demonic presence, consciousness was awake. Even though she was passed out, the demonic consciousness could tell what happened around her, even though she was passed out. It was awake 24/7, knew her most intimate thoughts and desires, and used those things against her. So when Prince did that one time, she said, she was furious, said, tomorrow you will lose the thing that you love most. And as it turns out, Prince had a quarter horse named Garland. And every day almost after work, he would ride it before dinner. And this was his prized possession. And the next day, he gets a phone call from his house man saying that Garland had been hit by a car and killed. So Prince was starting to get lured into Clara's world, and really had to quit his position. He was a lecturer at Tufts University and had to quit. And so he had to take a recounting of himself because this case was starting to wear on him so mightily.
Did he have any beliefs himself? Was he a Christian? Was he I don't know, did he have any spiritual beliefs himself?
Well, he again, this is society, not necessarily religion, but he and his family would go to church, and he would look at it as a civilizing force and something that was good for society. But he didn't necessarily believe that there were saints or devils or angels or those kind of things. To the contrary, though, William James very much did. And as we were discussing, believed that the spiritual world was far more prevalent and far more real than the world that we live in, this kind of matrix world,
What did William James think about this case at the end? After Carla became a socialite and I guess ingrained herself in society, normal society, so to speak. What did William James, did he ever talk about this case again, or was it something that he just forgot about?
He wrote a letter to Prince. Let me see if I can't find it. It's just a short letter, but it was in 1906 after the book came out, Dissociation of a Personality. So he kind of gives him a left-handed compliment, as they say. He says, Prince, dear Prince, you will hardly believe me, I fear, but I have only just attained to reading your dissociation book. Not only is the case destined to be historic, but your exposition is a masterpiece of lucidity and narrative art. But who or what is the demon? Isn't that the dark point? Ever truly yours, William James. And I think that tells you all you need to know. He refers to it as a demon, and he goes, you don't sort of get to the root cause here.
Was that question ever answered by any of them, in your opinion?
Oh, Richard Hodgson certainly believed it was demonic possession. So did Leonora Piper, and Hodgson wrote some papers on it, and and made references to it in the Psychical Society magazines, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So he was a firm believer, that this was demonic possession, and a firm believer in the spiritual world, and even that the spiritual world could be contacted. Like a lot of spiritualists, there were, I think it was 9 million spiritualists in Europe and the United States at that time, people that believed in mediums. So Arthur Conan Doyle, author of Sherlock Holmes, Madame Curie, founder of X-rays,
Charles Dickens.
Charles Dickens, yeah. So it was not an eccentric belief. And really, if you look at our society, Western society, almost every society in the world is believed in a spiritual world of one kind or another to a greater or lesser degree. It's really just since modern times, and I'd say you could probably clock it back to the atom bomb, where technology really started to create a secular view of the world. But this is a relatively recent development, and one that's unraveling as the new physics and as new ideas about the validity of Darwinian evolution come to the fore.
Mm. Can you talk about, without giving too much away about the book, can you talk about Carla's father and the siblings, what
Sure.
happened there?
Yeah. And this would be again one of these things where you can see it this way or you can see it that way. But Clara's father was a brutal man. He was an alcoholic and a wife beater. His wife died in right after childbirth from a fever that she contracted. Um, he was a brute, and actually there were indications that he was a part of a satanic cult. And you must remember Fall River, where Clara grew up, Fall River, Massachusetts, and that area, but particularly that town. This is where the Lizzie Borden axe murders happened. This is where just 4 miles down the road from Lizzie Borden, where she brutally murdered her father and mother, a farmhand named Juan Carriero axe murdered in the kitchen the wife of his boss. Interestingly enough, Lizzie Borden always said she was innocent, had no memory of anything like that. And Juan Carriero said the same. As a matter of fact, after he committed this incredibly brutal murder, he went into town and bought a pair of shoes with no memory of either one, with any memory of these assaults. So it's an interesting time. And as a matter of fact, I think in 1979, 1980, there was a satanic cult that was exposed in Fall River with 3 murders where a guy, I don't recall his name, I could find it easy, but where they stoned to death 3 young women. I guess they say Satan told them to do it.
Mm-hmm. So her father was part of a satanic club, allegedly. He was
Yes.
part of a
Yeah.
satanic cult, excuse me. And do you think that that opened a sort of doorway, or do you think that was what happened to her, why she became possessed?
Here's the take on that. Richard
'Cause-
Hodgson would say, of course, you invited the devil in and he came, and then a guy like Prince would say, well, this was so traumatic. These things were so traumatic. As it turned out, there was a detective involved, a city marshal, one of my favorite characters, who is Rufus Bassett Hilliard.
Mhm.
I really enjoyed researching this guy because he's very, very interesting. But he had investigated the Lizzie Borden murder, had investigated the Juan Corriero murder, and believed that Clara's father had murdered her 2 siblings. And so he went to Boston, followed her to Boston, hoping that she would give him some insight into how these infants died, because it was suspicious circumstances, and maybe testify against it. So Prince would say, well, this is a matter of the psychical catastrophe. This is what caused dissociation. Hodgson would say, well, it's clear. There were, animal sacrifices, these kinds of things. You're inviting the devil in, and yeah, he came.
Mhm. Yeah, Ron, I was going to ask you about Rufus. Can you explain more about his character? He's a good character in the book. He seems to be wrestling with this whole idea of Carla's possession, trying to figure it out, and the what's going on. Can you talk more about Rufus, the character?
Yeah, he was sort of an eccentric and mysterious fellow. As I said, he had investigated the two murders that really, along with Jack the Ripper and H.H. Holmes, there was a period in time where these brutal murders, I mean, serial killings, there was no such thing as serial killings until H.H. Holmes. And this is all around, 1888, 1890s, right in that pocket of time. And Rufus Bassett, they called him Bassett because he was like a basset hound, just, he wouldn't let go in terms of tracking things down. Uh, he firmly believed that in justice, and so he despised Clara's father, despised him, and had if you want to call it a vendetta, I don't know, a strong belief in justice. But interestingly enough, and this letter is actually in the Fall River Museum. It's a letter from Jack the Ripper to Bassett saying there's not just one killer.
So this happened. Jack the Ripper sent him a letter.
Yes, actually, I'll tell you exactly where the letter is. I just yeah, it's bear with me.
You've actually
it's at the Fall River Historical Society. Yeah.
So what are the chances Jack the Ripper sends this guy a letter about what was he implying? How did Jack the Ripper was this? So this was obviously a famous case back in the day.
Lizzie Borden was a worldwide case, certainly, yeah.
So Jack the Ripper felt impelled to write this letter to
I can't tell you. I have no idea, but
yeah.
Actually came, and I find the whole thing astounding, but it's true.
Yeah, you got to
like I said, if you want to go see the letter, you can go to Fall River, the Historical Society, and actually see it.
You got a quote in the book by Jack the Ripper. One day men will look back and say, I gave birth to the 20th century. How true do you think that quote is? You worked as a deputy sheriff, as you said at the beginning of this interview, and you've met men who have done, I guess, bad things. How true do you think that quote is?
I think it's very true. I mean, shortly thereafter, you had World War I, which was arguably the most brutal war imaginable, chemical warfare and all the rest. And again, there was just this rash, almost like a virus that was released. You had Lizzie Borden, you had Juan Carriero, you had Jack the Ripper, you had H.H. Holmes. These are all murders that society had never seen before. And so to this extent, I mean, I live in the United States. I don't think that 5 days go by when there isn't somebody that goes into a school or a hospital or wherever, a church, and shoots a half dozen or a dozen people. So these are all, this is all this kind of violence. I think is a phenomenon.
Do you think that you said at the beginning that evil is something that's real? That is definitely something that's real. So do you think do we have a choice? Can we accept evil? Can we reject evil? Where do we come in terms of evil?
I think that I believe it's sort of a classic view of this. I believe that in this world there's a Mother Teresa and there's a Jack the Ripper. Most of us fit, in somewhere in the middle. So you have your temptations. Maybe I do. Maybe I shouldn't. Have a glass of scotch, but I do. Maybe I shouldn't do this, but I do. And those are sort of human things, and you yield to temptation. But then on the other hand, there are people that become part and parcel of evil. They become evil. Ted Bundy becomes evil. I met a guy, and I don't want to get too graphic, but I'll just give you an example. I transported a motorcycle gang guy who chained a 12-year-old girl to a tree and propane torched her to death. Now, this is evil. This isn't, in the heat of anger or anything like that, which I find, very reasonable. I understand people get angry, there's jealousy, there's all these things, but this isn't that. This isn't that. And I believe that that even in my job transporting prisoners, I met people that were possessed. You don't have to have your head turned around, spit pea soup. There are occasionally examples like that, but evil is as real as bread. It's there, and it's undeniable. But so is good. There's also the mystery of good. People that donate their salaries to charity. A Mother Teresa. A soldier that jumps on a hand grenade to save the rest of the platoon. I mean, so it's both sides. I think in the spiritual world, it's no different. I think we're a reflection. We are the reflection of the spiritual world, where good and evil battle for the souls of human beings. I believe that.
Mm-hmm. What do you think of alien abduction? What do you think of aliens? Do you think that ties into this area at all? For now,
Yeah.
nowadays, there's a lot of people talking about, aliens. And do you think they have anything to do with our spiritual states?
That's a great question. And I'll tell you what, it's almost like a question I sent to you and said, please ask me this question. I wrote a book 15 years ago called The Mojave Incident about a case of alien abduction. And the connections, the similarities between what they described in their alien abduction case, which went on for hours, and they were retrogressed. So this was done clinically. And then the transcript from Clara Fowler, for example, both of them describe these demonic presences roughly the same. Red hot coal eyes, that sort of thing. Also, the smell of sulfur with the alien abductions and with this demonic presence. Also, and this is what leads me to believe this dichotomy and this battle. In the case of the Hesses, who were the alien abduction couple, in their darkest moment when they thought they had died and were in hell, an angelic presence comes that they called their comforter, and literally a swirling robes and angelic presence, and says, just like from the Bible, and says, you'll be all right, you'll get through this, just have faith, and then they go to sleep, and there's more that goes on. But if you think about Clara Fowler, I mean, this started with her with having visitations of Christ and of the Virgin Mary. So I find the similarities stunning. And as a matter of fact, under hypnosis, when they ask Dornhaus, they say, the psychiatrist says, bear with me, where do they come from? She talks about galaxies. What do they want to do? Why are they interested? She says, they want to study our emotions because they don't have them. We're made in God's image, but they're not. And then later, the probe gets more deep. And what about this? What about that? And she just quips, read the Bible. And this is under hypnosis, under deep hypnotic trance. And I found, all of those things pretty stunning. Steve Hess talks about, they say, what are they? Again, under hypnosis. I think they may have been physical at some time, at some point, but I think they've been here forever, since human beings were here on Earth, and now they're spiritual. And they can, come in different forms. And so this took on all of this, a very theological sort of lens. I mean, we talked about Prince's lens, we talked about Hodgson's lens, and I guess you know who Tucker Carlson is.
Sure.
Yeah. Let me just read something. This was from the show, Joe Rogan. He says, they're talking about alien abductions. If they're spiritual beings, which I believe they are, it's binary. They're either team good or team bad. They're supernatural because they're beyond nature as we understand it. These are an advanced race of beings from somewhere else, but the template that every society before us has used is a spiritual one. There's a whole world out there that we can't see that acts on people, a spiritual world that's acting on us good and bad all the time. Richard Hodgson, 125 years before, writes about the Clara Fowler case. The one fact about demonic possession so remarkable in our time is the power these hostile beings exert among men and what they may, in far more subtle and less obvious ways, do to corrupt us. I mean, they sound like really the same.
Similar, yes, it's the same thing.
So I think that alien abduction and demonic possession are closely tied. I don't know exactly how, but I think they're closely tied.
It posed the question when you were saying that earlier on. I was kind of thinking, well, if we're made in God's image and they aren't, who made them? Like if they're from other parts of the universe, or if they're wherever they're from, they had to have been made by someone or something, and which begs the question, what or who?
Yeah.
You know, so do you have any theories?
Yeah, I think that even physicists now, are talk. There's two things I want to point out about a secular society, and it's not. I'm not a big religious guy. These are just observations I've made. One is evolution, and so this, again, there is no God. This was, some accident of nature. Microbes in a swamp, and we developed. Sir Francis Crick, who won the Nobel Prize in 1958 for the
DNA, wasn't it?
discovery of DNA.
Hmm.
So, a huge mind, said the odds of evolution, Darwinian evolution, being true would be the equivalent of a tornado going through a junkyard, leaving behind the 747 jet that flies to Europe and back. That's how unlikely it is that in this time frame, a human being with a consciousness. So he argues for a creator. And
Hmm.
of course, you can ask, where's the fossil chain? If we derive from some microbe, there's got to be some chain, some fossil chain, and there isn't. So there are other theories about that. The other is Newtonian physics, which everything is sort of based on until, maybe, Max Planck and Einstein and whatnot started looking at things differently. But Max Planck, who was one of the founders of quantum mechanics, said the odds that we see reality as it is zero. And so all of the Newtonian physics that we say, well, this makes sense because this goes to that. You drop an apple, there's gravity. It isn't that simple, and it isn't real. It's a theory, like evolution. It's just a theory,
Hmm.
and really, it's fairly easy to disprove because
Hmm.
quantum mechanics totally throws it on its ear. And so, a lot of the foundations of what our philosophical view of the world is based on two very false premises. And so if
Hmm.
they're false, well, then you say maybe we don't know much of anything. And I think
Hmm.
that's the case.
It's like Immanuel Kant. He said we cannot see. It's the exact same thing. We can't see the thing in itself. You know, where the noumena are I forget the actual term, but he said that we're very limited in our perception, and I can see where Max Planck is coming from with that idea. What other cases, Ron, do you think are equivalent or nearly the same as Carla's case? Well, if you were to pick another case that really boggles your mind, which really, piques your interest, which other case? Well, I guess would it be the Exorcist case, of the little boy?
Yeah,
Or
I think that's in terms of Blatty's research, that was one that really stuck out. And of course, this was he was a student, I believe, in 1949, I think, and,
Mhm.
at Georgetown. And I guess one of the Washington newspapers, maybe the Washington Examiner, had a story, small story about this boy that was in Maryland at the time. He wound up having hospitalized in St. Louis, but that was possessed. That despite all these things, and Blatty research had actually talked to some of the people involved, and then some of the notes that they had. They really tried to protect the identity of this boy, and they did for years and years. But then finally, it came out maybe 10 years ago or so. But he found that to be a very well documented and convincing and compelling case.
Mhm.
Yeah.
What was your relationship like with Blatty? What was he? How long did you obviously knew him for many many years?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it wasn't like I talked to him every day or anything like that. But when I had something that I had wanted to get published or wanted an opinion on, I would go to him.
Hmm.
And I'll tell you a funny story. After I met him in '72, he said, "Well, the next book you write, I'll give you a hand with." And as a matter of fact, he was moving a lot. He had a place in Aspen, had a place in Beverly Hills, a place in Georgetown, and he moved quite a bit. So he said, "I'll tell my secretary if I move, to let you know so you know where I am, which is really pretty incredible. And so about 4 years later, I had another book. So I'd been corresponding a bit, and I have this new book. And I said, I'm going to drop it off. He said, no, put it in the mail or whatever. I said, no. I want to hand deliver it, you know? And as you know, it's a lot easier to say no on the telephone or in a letter. It's not so easy to say no if you're looking somebody in the eye. So, and the fact that you've come all that way. So he was had a place in Malibu, and he was staying that week at the Beverly Hills Hotel because it was Oscar week. So I show up at the Beverly Hills Hotel where I was supposed to meet him and deliver the manuscript. And I was a deputy sheriff at the time, young. I had one suit. It was a winter suit. And I was in California in 90-some degree weather. And I go to the Beverly Hills Hotel. I have $85 in my pocket and no credit cards. This was a while ago. And they say, well, he's not here. I go, what do you mean he's not here? He's got to be here. No, he's not here. He checked out yesterday. I said, what? So I tell this guy my sad story. I show him the manuscript. The manager says, look, there's an address on a piece of paper, a small piece of paper that's in his mailbox. I don't know what it has to do with, but obviously he'd given it to in case of an emergency. So he said, here's the address, but I didn't give it to you. I take a cab to Sherman Oaks. It cost me about $85. So I get there, I have no money. I'm sweating like crazy. I knock on the door to this house, and Tippi Hedren, the actress from The Birds, answers. So this beautiful blonde answers the door. Melanie Griffith, her daughter, is about 13 at the time with braces on her teeth, and she's in the background. And I go, is Bill Blatty here? And she goes like, why do you ask that? And I tell her my sad story. So she's a very nice woman. So she invites me in. Says, well, he's out to lunch with my husband, Noel Marshall, who's the producer of The Exorcist. They'll be back. I don't know when, you know, they're probably celebrating. So I wait there. I'm sitting on a couch and really hot and just exhausted. You know, the whole experience. I just gotten off a plane from Virginia to Los Angeles, cabs, just, you know, just washed out. There's a stuffed animal on the couch of a sort of lion cub, and it starts moving and starts walking around. So I go to her, I said, you know, maybe I'm hallucinating. It's been a long day, but is that stuffed animal walking around? She goes, oh, that's my pet lion. No sooner does that happen than a female lion that's probably about 150 pounds starts rubbing against my leg like a cat would, you know, like a house cat. And I go, you know, is this dangerous? Like, is my life in jeopardy? Is this thing going to bite me or something? So she goes, not if you don't try to hurt me. I said, well, there's no chance of me trying to hurt you. She said, well, then we're okay. So Blatty came back. We went out to dinner, and I wound up, he invited me to Malibu, to his place in Malibu afterwards. And I actually drove to the Academy Awards with him in the limousine, and he dropped me off at the airport.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
You were in a room and with a lion and Melanie Griffith with her braces on, waiting for. Well,
Yeah.
that's a crazy story, Ron.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So, Ron, I want to thank you for your time, and it's been great listening to you. Just before you go, I heard you mentioning in an interview once, and there's a writer I like, and it's Dostoevsky. You like Dostoevsky. What can he tell us about this phenomenon, about, like, in terms of what Carla went through? What do you think his books tell us or inform us? I know he wrote
Absolutely. If you look at Crime and Punishment, I mean, Dostoevsky in his writing, of course, it's about a student that commits a murder, really to prove how smart he is, and, you know, absolute pride and stupidity. And basically, the philosophy that he puts forward is much like the one I discussed, that you know, you can be lured into murder by pride or stupidity or whatever, but it's a choice. It's a choice. And that and then, by the way, Raskolnikov becomes religious at the end. Really, his sister brings a Bible into prison for him, and he converts. So, I mean, Dostoevsky's point of view, I think, is very clear. There is a spiritual world. Human beings are influenced moment to moment by spiritual forces, and sometimes they succumb. And fortunately, most of the time, they don't.
What percentage of the population would you say are possessed? We're all swayed to a certain degree here and there to do right or wrong, and it can be a small thing, or in the case of some criminals, big things. But what percentage of the population would you think is actually possessed?
Well, I'll tell you, I can answer that indirectly. The Vatican, the Catholic Church, had a handful of exorcists in the United States and around the world. A handful in the United States. So by that I mean 7 or 8. They have 150 now, and they're actually trained by the Vatican and report to the Vatican like a team of soldiers or a special forces group almost. So the idea of possession is anything but obsolete. And as a matter of fact, if you look at something like that, I mean, you don't hire more employees at a company unless there's more work.
Have you ever seen an exorcism?
Just on film, not in person. Very compelling.
Did you ever see that video? Just as a side, did you ever see that video on YouTube of the Virgin Mary appearing in Egypt over a church?
Sure, I did.
Do you think that?
By the way, I think that's some of the most compelling arguments again for the spiritual world is exactly that.
Do you think that's real?
Oh yeah, yeah. It was viewed by 250,000 people over, I think, 4 years, including President Nasser, the president of Egypt, and that footage is remarkable. And it's not just one picture. There's a whole host of photographs that are verified, and also if you look at Fatima and the Virgin Mary there, the sun, the miracle of the sun, and if you look at the Shroud of Turin, which again has been there's a whole revision to the way they're looking at that. They did it with carbon testing, carbon dating. And they know it's not a painting. They know it's not, phony. They don't know. They can't recreate it themselves. Nobody can recreate it. But they did a carbon test a number of years ago, I think in the 70s, and concluded that it was not from Christ's time, that it was newer than that. However, they pulled a very small section because that's all they were allowed to. And it'd been through a fire. And there had been sections that were replaced. And there were also sections that were scorched. And so many people would say that carbon dating was tainted. However, more recently, I think in 2022, they did a more accurate measure of time. It was called wide angle X-rays. And what it does is measure the cellulose in the linen. And they know how fast cellulose deteriorates in linen. And so they could track it, and it tracked back to the time of Christ. And as a matter of fact, the most recent explanations, since we know it's not painting, we know it's not all the rest, is that it was radiation, that there was a burst of radiation that created this. And the radiation didn't come from outside. It came from underneath, from inside, from the body of Christ, in which case you could make a case that this is the moment of resurrection. Again, the lens you want to look at it through, but one way or the other, it's a very compelling story like the other two.
Yeah, I totally agree there. Or excuse me, I was thinking about Barry Schwartz there, the expert on the Shroud of Turin. Ron, where can people find your stuff? Where can people check you out?
Well, I'm going to hold it up if that's okay.
Sure, 100%, 100%.
So it's called The Unwelcomed, The Curious Case of Clara Fowler. And it can be purchased on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or your local bookstore. And like I said, you mentioned just 2 weeks ago, just won the Mafia Award with the publishers present their best work, John Grisham, Stephen King, all the rest, for 12 categories. And then they have Book of the Year, which supersedes the 12 categories. And the Unwelcomed was named the Book of the Year by the Maxi Committee.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. It's fantastically written. It really is, and I like to read a lot of novels. It's such a good novel. I say again, I'm halfway through it now. I only got it the other day, but it's a fantastic, Ron. A fantastic piece of literature. Ron, I'm going to have that in the description anyways of the video. So if people want to check it out, just go down below on the description and you'll see a link to the book. Ron, thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed listening to you, and I have to say I'm really impressed by your Brazilian jiu-jitsu and your boxing. So maybe
Are
we
you a
can
boxing fan? I think maybe you are.
Yeah, sure I am.
Oh,
Absolutely,
sure.
100%. So I think maybe we
Great
can
Irish fighters.
yeah, there you go. There you go. I wouldn't call myself an expert now, but definitely I have an interest. Ron, thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure, Mick. And again, questions were great. It was really, the time went by like minutes.
Fantastic, Ron. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.